As an executive coach and mentor, what I do for my clients is help them make massive progress on the things that matter to them. And a lot of the time that has to do with figuring out what their blockages are, figuring out what's holding them back, and to that we need to turn to psychology. And the problem with psychology is that there are literally hundreds of different schools that explain the human animal and our behavior in very different ways. And when you look at the results of the different psychological modalities, when you do experiments and you assess how well they all work pretty much the same and not that well. Not that many people get better, and the people who get better don't get better that much. Today's guest decided to look for the bright spots, to look for cases, and every therapist, no matter what they do, has a couple of these at least, where someone made rapid, comprehensive transformation, almost like on a dime, like in a single session there was a transformation, and they didn't go back, they didn't relapse, they didn't have to work hard to maintain it. It was just like something was undone and redone. And he began studying these. And he and his partners collected hundreds of case studies and started looking for what they had in common. And about 30 years ago, patterns began emerging. And about 25 years ago, the neuroscience of transformational change was unlocked. And so that's what we're going to talk about in today's conversation with Dr. Bruce Ecker, the co-originator of coherence therapy and the author of Unlocking the Emotional Brain. This is amazing stuff. So without further ado, Dr. Bruce Ecker, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
I'm so happy to be here with you, Howie.
Yeah, we got a lot to talk about. I have been studying with you for I think it's close to a year now, and so I'm really excited to have a one-on-one without all those other pesky students and their needs and.
Well, really, I've always enjoyed you're in the group, in the big group that you're in that meets every 2 weeks. I've noticed that your observations, like you've watched me do quite a few live sessions, as well as together the group has watched videos of sessions I've done and other therapists. And your questions and observations are very astute. I really enjoy the penetrating and deep thinking quality of how you respond to things. So I appreciate you being in the group.
Wow. Well, thank you. As a non-therapist, I feel like I snuck into Hogwarts somehow, even though I don't know how to do magic.
You know more than you think you know. Then, okay, which is good.
So, cool. So let's talk about it. What the work that you and some collaborators have brought into the world and have kind of named certain things and have synthesized very disparate fields of exploration to put this together. To me, I have trouble talking about it with people because I can tell they think I'm a huckster. Because when I say this is what it is, this is what it can do, this is what I've seen, it's like I'm some Tony Robbins offshoot who went to half a seminar and now thinks he can cure the world. And so I'm actually very careful about how I talk about it. But it is amazing stuff, and you are one of the people at the forefront of kind of collating it and synthesizing it and sharing it with the world.
Well, what you said rings true for me too. I really recognize in what you said my experience also. We've had to learn how to present, write about, speak about, and teach this material to the therapy field. That's our main focus: therapists, counselors, and coaches, of course. And it seems too good to be true, based on the existing baseline of knowledge in the psychotherapy and counseling and coaching field. It seems too good to be true. I know it does. And it's more definite knowledge of how deep change works than the therapy field dreamed is possible for 100 years. And so if we present this full strength at an introductory level, it's beyond credibility to many in the audience. And so we've had to learn how to present it to not encounter a kind of a backlash of disbelief or, huckster, whatever. It's a real problem. And I think we've gotten the knack. So, have at me and let's see how I do here.
All right. Yeah, this may not make sense to people at this point, but suddenly, like, the resistance could be the therapy industry's need to experience grief over what they've been doing for the past 100 years.
That's in the mix. I think it is.
Yeah. So I'd love to start with where you started out. Maybe a short biography of young Bruce and how you got to exploring this stuff.
Well, I was born very young. Actually, I'm not sure how far back you want me to go here.
Well, did you think you were going to be a psychologist when you were a kid?
No. That really came quite late. It was in my freshman year in college that I took a physics course. When I took physics in high school, I wasn't that interested in it. But when I took a physics course, I thought I would do some kind of applied math when I went to college. I've always loved figuring things out and arriving at clarity of how things work. And applied math seemed to embody that. But then I took a physics course and loved it. So I switched my major to physics and fell in love with physics, majored in physics, and then became a physicist. I was in graduate school in physics at University of California, Berkeley, UCB. But the Vietnam War was raging, and I was about to be drafted into the Vietnam War. So I found a job doing physics research that got me, I lucked out. I found a draft-deferred job in a company that was doing some of its own research for the Defense Department. So I got a deferral, even though the company agreed never to put me on a military project. Huh. So I just threaded the needle there and began working shoulder to shoulder with PhD physicists, which I wasn't yet. I had to drop out of grad school before I got the degree. So I had a 14-year career doing physics research. And at first really enjoyed it. My love of physics was actually my yearning to see into what reality, what's at the heart of existence. That was really my calling.
And at what level was this physics? Was it like, dark matter particle physics?
Oh no, I was wanted to head for very fundamental physics or cosmology. Yeah. But I had to get a job, and I worked at the field that they needed help with, which was a very applied, it was various uses of very intense electron beams and the interaction of these electron beams with the gases they're shooting through and ionizing the gas, and rather complex stuff, and using big complicated apparatuses to do this. So, I learned a lot about how to do that kind of complicated work, and working in a team with people. I learned a lot about that. So it was good stuff. But after several years, I started to feel like, this doesn't really get to the heart of things. Okay, it's puzzle solving, but it didn't satisfy my desire. So, after about 5 years, I began looking around. What else could I do that more feels aligned? So it took me I did that physics work for about 14 years before I transitioned over and went back to graduate school to learn psychotherapy. And I brought with me my physics mind, my systematic thinking, my need to define things clearly enough to make unambiguous sense, and my ability to ponder complex systems, complex phenomena, and arrive at clarity. And I brought all that to the psychotherapy field, and that's why you see our work has the nature it has. And the colleagues, who've joined me, similarly, are aligned with that sensibility. That's why we get together so well. So our work has this quality that wasn't so common previously in the therapy field.
And yeah, I mean, the other thing I think you must have brought from physics is you don't do anything until you have a theoretical background to test against.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I can't imagine you were shooting electrons willy-nilly. So we don't really understand this stuff. Like, you had predictions, you had...
That's right. You had Maxwell's equations, the fundamental laws of electromagnetic phenomena that we were using to rigorously analyze the behavior of these beams. Yeah. Right.
So why psychotherapy? Like, it seems like if you're looking to get to the bottom of things, it seems like people seem it pretty bottomless.
Yeah, right. And endlessly complex, right? And messy. Well, like I said, my real quest was what's at the heart of reality. I couldn't help it. That's what I was hungry for as a human being. As well as having enough fun and eating good food, of course. But by pursuing physics, I guess you could say I successfully ruled out the analytical line of approach to fathoming reality, right? And I saw that it doesn't work. I actually sat and interviewed a number of very esteemed, legendary physicists. When I was at my undergrad school, Cornell, I was in a room with Hans Bethe, one of the most important physicists of the 20th century. And I asked him, questions about quantum theory and, what do these equations tell us about what's real? And from him and from many other readings, it was clear. The equations tell us nothing. The equations are brilliant modeling that cranks out the right numbers. So somehow it's tracking what's real. But to this day, 100 years later, physicists are at a loss to know what quantum theory and quantum physics tells us about the nature of reality. There's many vying interpretations. So I knew that physics doesn't really go there. It looks like it does, and then it doesn't. It's endlessly mathematical modeling that leaves physicists scratching their heads about, well, what's this telling us about reality? So I switched to the subjective line of approach, consciousness, our own mind, as the only other avenue then. And started studying not just psychology, but the world's different systems of knowledge about how consciousness discovers its own true nature, right? And
Like what were some of the?
There's all the major, familiar. There's different forms of Buddhism that address that. What the Buddha taught. There's different forms of in Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, especially. Hinduism has ancient, detailed writings about exactly that, goes into great detail. These are thousands of years of people really heading for that. And so there's a lot of knowledge there that is not present in Western societies. So I've studied a lot of that stuff. and so doing psychotherapy became a way to hang out fully in the subjective zone. And I've always regarded all of my therapy sessions as from a sort of there's a psychotherapy a psychology journal article called The Local Clinical Scientist. It's a tradition within the psychotherapy world where you regard each of your sessions as your point of access, your laboratory for understanding how the mind works. And of course, your main job is to really help your clients, of course. And I took that responsibility very seriously. But I looked at every session that way as learning how the mind works, and as well as trying to apply theories and systems of psychotherapy successfully. And now I guess the story gets to more closer relevance to what we're going to be talking about, which is that in my early years after finishing grad school and beginning to see clients in practice, it was clear that all the systems of therapy I'd learned in grad school were not terrifically efficient at creating decisive change, liberating change for clients. And then over the first few years, occasionally it happened, occasionally a major breakthrough happened. And I was now working in close conjunction or in sort of a clinical partnership with Laurel Hulley, who I then married, but that's a detail in this story, I guess. But our clinical collaboration is the main thing there. And we found that indeed a decisive, liberating, lasting change happened very occasionally. And it was like a surprise when it did, like, whoa, what did we do that led to that? So literally, when we saw that it was possible, and of course, in graduate school, you read of a few cases of that kind. I'm not saying we discovered such a degree of change, but when we saw it occasionally happen accidentally, serendipitously in our own sessions, we, caught fire with the spirit of, whenever we don't know why it happened, but whenever that happens, we're going to study it as thoroughly as we can and try to see what made it happen. So we did that across different clients, different symptoms or problems for several years, trying to see if we could systematically learn what brings about that level of what we began calling transformational change, which means major symptom stops and never comes back.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of what you were doing then compared to most of the rest of the field is that people, like, I think of psychotherapy, it's like the Yankees and the Red Sox. It's like, you got Freud and Jung and,
Sure.
Reich and Adler and people like who they study with really, Rogers, that like, this is my team and we have the right model. And what you were doing seemed very trans-theoretical. Like, we're just looking at like what works as opposed to we know what we do works and it just doesn't
Yes.
always work, or the clients are resistant to it, or
Yeah, exactly. And we had learned, a sizable number of different systems. And that became the spirit of our approach. Like, I think we think of it as phenomenological, which is pay attention to what's actually happening in the therapist, thoughts, feelings, body sensations, actions, behaviors, moods, and again, using every session to learn how symptom production works and what is it that ends the happening of a particular problem pattern or symptom. Whatever the different theoretical camps say or however they describe it, with minimal theorizing, try to eliminate all preconception and just see what operates and what works. And so that was our approach. And by the early 1990s, this approach began in the 1986-ish. And by the early 1990s, we felt we had nailed down what are the ingredients that bring about transformational change. And it wasn't anything that we had seen named in any of our studies of existing therapy systems. maybe we missed something, but we didn't see it. So we put together, once we identified the key ingredients, in our own minds, we defined that as what we're trying to bring about from session one, literally from session one. How do we bring the client to that set of experiences? It was a particular set of subjective experiences that was always present leading up to a client describing this kind of breakthrough and transformation and change. So we just started figuring out how do we head for that from session one, and our whole system of therapy, which we initially called depth-oriented brief therapy, but then renamed coherence therapy several years later, is made of. It all grew from just continuously learning how to facilitate that set of experiences. And then in 2005, I was searching for, I began searching through neuroscience research literature at the urging of one of my younger mentees at the time. He was very interested in that. He got me interested in it. And I began searching. We all did. He and one other mentee and I began searching. And I was on vacation with Laurel down in San Luis Obispo, California, visiting Hearst Castle, which is a mind-blowing place. And late one night in our hotel room, I went back to the computer and looked through more neuroscience research articles, and went to bed, still on the search, and lying there in bed, somehow my mind realized, wait a minute, one of those articles. I got up, went back and found it, and that was it. That was the 2004 study by an Argentinian group of neuroscientists that was the first study to detect what experiences. These laboratory researchers are all about procedures, the external procedures. That's they're trained to just think and describe in terms of. But this study described the subjective experiences that have to be created to trigger this thing called memory reconsolidation, which I hadn't heard of before. It had only been discovered 5 years earlier.
Yeah, was this a study in humans or rodents?
No, this was a study in crabs.
Crabs.
Turns out that memory reconsolidation was discovered by evolution very early. So nematodes, which are tiny worms, have memory reconsolidation to revise. Well, here we go. Memory reconsolidation is the nervous systems. I don't know if a nematode has a brain. Usually I say brain at this point in the sentence, right? But it's the nervous system or brain's built-in process for revising what it previously learned, right? It gets a little hard for humans to imagine nematodes learning stuff and updating their knowledge. So I think we'll switch to humans very soon here. But for example, suppose you grow up with a parent who gets triggered into rages and inflicts a lot of suffering. Well, in growing up in that family, you learn a lot about how to stay safe and not trigger that stuff, or at least try to not trigger that stuff. In fact, for every specific form of suffering created, you learn a very specific avoidance tactic. You learn the existence of that suffering. You learn how it works, what triggers it. You learn what to do to try to keep it from happening to you. And you don't know you're learning any of that. So it's called implicit knowledge, right? And it's very specific and powerful because it's learned in the presence of emotion. Neuroscientists have shown separately, rigorously, that anything learned in the presence of while feeling strong emotion becomes extremely potent knowledge that will last a lifetime.
Yeah, I have a weird example of that.
Yeah, what?
When before my wife and I were married, we were vacationing together, and I got the news, and she's originally from South Africa, and her first language is Afrikaans. I got the news on the phone that my father had died, and I was, collapsed on the bed crying, and she called her mother and had a conversation in Afrikaans, and I remember the Afrikaans. I didn't know the language, but I can, to this day I can hear the complete sentences
That's
of a
it.
language that I did not speak as I was,
That's
in the throes of grief.
What an amazing example of that, Howie. That's really amazing, and just
Oh.
so shows the reality of that. Sometimes that's called a flashbulb memory.
Hmm.
I have a flashbulb memory of the moments I heard that President John F. Kennedy had been shot.
Hmm.
I was walking along a corridor in my high school toward a left turn. You had to turn left a few feet ahead. So I'm walking toward that, and some other kids are coming around the corner toward me, and one of them says, "The president's been shot." And what I heard, because this is not a possible thought, right?
Right.
What I heard is the president has gone hunting. That's what my mind did with that, because I had no place to put the actual words.
Hmm.
And it had to come in a few times for me to hear the words that he said. And I remember the scene, and I don't have a lot of vivid, memories like that from back then. Yeah, flashbulb memories. So anything learned in the presence of strong emotion, boy, sticks. That's how the brain's emotional learning system evolved for hundreds of millions of years.
Right. And it seems like there's something about that type of learning about how to stay safe that the brain doesn't trust to consciousness because we're so complicated. We'll analyze it and we'll screw it up.
Right. Well, first of all, yeah, there's several dynamics that keep it from being conscious knowledge. One of them is you don't know you're learning it at the time you're learning it. The implicit learning system is amazingly effective and vast, and our conscious knowledge and our capacity for conscious thinking and knowing and choosing is very limited. And the amount of stuff that living organisms need to know to survive is way beyond the conscious capacity. So we have this implicit learning system. You don't even know you're learning it. It's in there, and it'll keep triggering on cue as needed for the rest of your life. It's built to not fade out once it's learned on that level. And so, but memory reconsolidation is the brain's way to change even that stuff. And the therapy field and the whole psychology field didn't know the brain had such a mechanism until essentially the year 2000. The last few years of the 1900s, there were a few studies that finally gelled at 2000. And what do you know? There it is. There's this way the brain can take a very specific piece of that kind of emotional learning and literally unlock the physical encoding in the brain of that specific learning and allow new learning to rewire it and rewrite it such that it isn't there anymore in the same way. So you're not just overriding, like most of the psychotherapy field operates through what we call counteractive learning or competitive learning. You learn the positive patterns you wish you had, you wish you lived by, and you set them up as well as you can. And the idea is to make that happen instead of the existing pattern. And you're trying to override the existing pattern. And it's not very effective. Relapses happen. And it usually produces a degree of reduction of the problem pattern, but not a profound elimination. But this memory reconsolidation is a fundamentally different process down to the neural level that can truly eliminate the unwanted pattern.
So what did psychotherapy think was the limits of what was possible. So that I don't, the experiments, I don't know, on like, rats or mice with, with electric shocks, where you could introduce some competitive stimulus, but the original one would always be there and always be triggerable. It's like there's some kind of like landmine in your psyche.
Yes.
And it has to be protected, and you try to stay away from it.
It's late, let's see, 1989. The procedure that we all know the name of for this is extinction, right? Starting with Pavlov in the 1920s, who did all kinds of different procedures with animal learning and unlearning. And extinction, you train the dog to salivate when the dog hears the bell, because initially the bell sounds and the food comes immediately. So the dog knows, oh, the food's coming. But then after that pattern is set up with many repetitions, you ring the bell and you don't show any food, the dog salivates anyway, right? The dog has learned what the bell means. The dog has an expectation, a very specific expectation of what that bell means, and salivates. So extinction is you ring the bell with no food many, 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 many times, and you think you're going to unlearn, you're going to drive the unlearning of that expectation. Well, guess what? Decades of research, all the way to the end of the 20th century, showed in hundreds and hundreds of studies, extinction never eliminates the original learning. It creates a new learning that the bell means nothing is going to happen. And both learnings are there, and they compete. And you can get either one to dominate depending on how you manipulate the procedure. You can easily reactivate the original learning of expecting food to come and salivating. And so there's the prototypical example of competitive or counteractive learning, where the original is still there. Memory, and so for nearly 100 years, they did all these experiments without identifying what they finally identified in those last years of the 1900s and really arrived at in the year 2000, that there is a different procedure than extinction that does fundamentally update and revise the original target learning and can eliminate it. Now, I really feel I should say and emphasize memory reconsolidation. An analogy is helpful. Electricity. When electricity was discovered, right? Well, we all know electricity can take many, many different forms, myriad, unlimited forms. Electricity is not defined by my air conditioner. Electricity is not defined by an iron that you smooth clothing with. You can smooth food with it too, but I don't recommend it.
Well, that was how we made toasted cheese in the dorm.
Where did that come from? My electric stove. Yeah, electricity takes many forms. Memory reconsolidation can be facilitated to alter what's already there in memory in any different way. It can weaken it, strengthen it, revise the details of what's expected, revise the response when the trigger happens, or erase, or let's say unlearn. I shouldn't have said erase because it means crazy things to people. We learned the hard way by using that word initially. But it's unlearning. It's true unlearning that nullifies the original learning, right? So maybe an example is good here. An example that I like to use is a fellow who had severe social anxiety. He described it as like getting very tight when he's among people, and like in a way that he can hardly think and can barely get himself to speak when he's among people. And it emerged that he learned this. He learned the expectation, and when he first in his first session, he was clueless about that He didn't even know he had negative expectations of other people. That's how fully implicit or non-conscious this learning was. But I did our process with him, and he became regularly aware that he expects people to respond to him the way his father did thousands of times throughout his childhood, right? The classic thing, a little mistake by a little boy, perfectly normal mistake, father triggers into bellowing rage in front of friends or family members visiting. How can you be so stupid? What's wrong? Just tears him down, shames him brutally. And this happens so many times. So he knows that the slightest thing that is a misstep, an error, a blunder, and others are going to do that to him again. And so there we have the generalization that the emotional learning system does. When we're little, we don't realize we're assuming that our parents are representative samples of human beings. And we grow up expecting other people, all other people often, to respond the same ways our parents did to us. Not always, but it's very common. So he was, without realizing it, expecting that others will, shame and humiliate him and scream at him the way his father did. So he was tightening up, and the tightening up really had the protective function of keeping him from risking saying anything, because that's where the danger is. You could say something, or I could say something wrong. And we used this process to have him unlearn the generalization, or I used it, I was the therapist, because that generalization was the specific learning that was generating his social anxiety and freezing up in his body in the present.
Yeah. So can I pause here for a second? Because I think I'm imagining what people are thinking who are familiar with psychology, or they've watched movies about with people getting therapy, is that the person you would say, you would explain to him what you just said to me. You generalized. Everyone in the world is not like your parent, not like your father, and therefore you don't have to be afraid. And he would go, oh wow, doc, you're right. That's amazing. And he would be cured. But we do that all the time to people. It's our instinct to explain to people why they're thinking wrong, what they should be thinking instead. That's I think the basis of much of cognitive behavioral therapies and rational, emotive, all that stuff, is like if people just understood and we explained to them, and then they can own their dysfunctional thoughts and just replace them, then they'll be better. And this is kind of the opposite of what you're talking about.
Well, in the sense that conceptual understanding, intellectual understanding, turns out to be just another counteractive, competitive piece of new learning that doesn't have the potency to change the existing emotional learning, which is not in the intellect. It's not in the upper cerebral cortex. It's in different brain regions and in the body, right? That evolved to do emotional learning. It's amazing to me, it still is, that these implicit emotional learnings do not exist in words or concepts at all. And yet they are completely specific, right? A dog doesn't have words and concepts, right? I mean, they may learn what we teach them, but, when a dog learns that, what's a good emotional learning of a dog? That snakes. So suppose a dog got bitten by a snake at a certain age. That dog is not going to forget that snakes are dangerous. Mm-hmm. Right? That's an emotional learning. It involves perception. It involves the pain of the bite. Say the dog got bitten.
And it might get generalized to garden hoses.
Yes, absolutely. So these are very specific learnings that don't need concepts or words at all to exist. So right, if I had just explained the way you described Will to my client, it wouldn't have had any effect. And in fact, it has negative effects because it doesn't work. But the client thinks it's supposed to work because a wise therapist explained it as if the therapist thinks this should make the pattern stop happening. So then the client feels like a failure because it doesn't work. So it's what's called iatrogenic, where the cure does harm. The treatment does harm. So no, we never approach therapy by relying on rational understanding to make the existing patterns to stop happening. No, it has to be experiential. It has to be the creation of the experiences, like I said when we began talking. The experiences that do the memory reconsolidation process in the form that does unlearning. This is a very special subset of how memory reconsolidation works. It's the maximally effective version of memory reconsolidation that focuses on a particular target emotional learning and brings about these experiences that unlearn and nullify that learning. And the way, so should I go ahead and say how I did it with him?
I think that'd be a practical.
Yeah. Let's see. I'll try and do it as succinctly as I can to just get the gist of this described. Once we had learned, now, so the discovery phase comes first, and that's actually not memory consolidation yet. That's the first phase of coherence therapy, is find and reveal and experience the emotional learning that is underlying and driving the problem pattern as the client consciously experiences it. For him, it was this tightness, right? This experience, can't talk. Vast range, people describe depressed mood, people describe compulsive eating, you name it, right? Anxiety, panic attacks, vast range of presenting patterns that people want to get free of when they come for therapy. So the first phase of coherence therapy is to work efficiently and experientially to bring the client into awareness, where we're bringing awareness to the implicit learning that's outside of awareness initially. So that's driving the problem pattern. So I worked with him, and I think it was in 2 sessions, had him now very directly in touch with what he suffered. He knew his father had rage. That wasn't outside of awareness. A distinction we like to make in coherence therapy is the distinction between what was suffered and what was learned from what was suffered. What was learned from what was suffered is what's outside of awareness. Usually people have some awareness of what they suffered. Not always, boy. Some clients, therapy clients, don't have initially even any awareness of what they suffered. So we have to start there to get to it. But he knew, he easily described what his father's behaviors were, and that led to him also being aware of what he learned from what he suffered, which is, if I do one thing wrong, either in words or action, that's the kind of response I'll get from others who see it.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I love the discovery part the best, because I took notes during one of the sessions, and I wrote, I don't know if anyone said the word, but I wrote it down like agentic, like or being that you used that word, right?
Yeah, we use that word in our writing and teaching. The discovery process arrives at the person experiencing that the problem pattern, which initially they think of in conventional terms as, well, either bad, sick, stupid, or crazy, right? And the therapy field has very pathologizing terms for the problem pattern. Maladaptive, pathogenic, dysfunctional, disorders. Everything is named a disorder in the official therapy manual, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. Everything is a disorder. Hundreds of disorders. The therapy field teaches people that they're broken, and they're not. Like my client discovered when he got to this, he thought his freezing up meant something's broken, that he's pathological. And instead, he realizes that this was valid emotional learning. Makes total sense that he expects this from other people, given what he experienced and suffered as a boy. And that's why we call it coherence therapy, because all these emotional learnings are coherent. They fully make sense and, in fact, are adaptive emotional learnings. He was freezing up, keeping himself from talking to avoid the suffering he learned will happen. Where's the pathology in that? I don't see any. And neither did he once he became aware of all that. So indeed, the client recognizes that what looked like a pathological, irrational pattern is fully cogent, fully coherent, and is the client's own agency in striving for safety or survival or justice or well-being. Agency is one of the key results of the discovery phase.
Yeah, and one of the metaphors I find helpful with clients is to say, imagine you're trying to navigate London, but you have a map of Paris.
Right. I think our way of trying to say that is you can't move from a position you don't have. Mm-hmm. Or from a position you don't know you have. You can only move from the position you have if you know you have it. So yes, I fear all people intensely because they're ready to pounce on me like my father did. Once he owns that and knows that, now he's in the position, knowingly taking the position that he actually has, right? And we're going to help him change that position by unlearning the expectation that as soon as I learn from him that's what's operating, that specific expectation, which I didn't know. In coherence therapy, we always, when we train, we emphasize you learn from the client what the operative emotional learning is that's maintaining the pattern. You're not going to try and figure it out and brilliantly diagnose it, right? Like a Viennese master. No, you're going to make it show up in the client, and you're going to learn it from the client. And then both the client and you know it accurately, and nobody's taking anybody's word for it. There's no theoretical thing happening. It's what's really there showing up.
Yeah, and as I look back on transcripts of sessions that I've done with clients, I can see exactly how my brilliance is what gets in the way. And I like to put that word in quotation marks, but it really does feel like, oh, I got it. I got there ahead of them, or I see, or this reminds me of this thing from the book. And every single time it either breaks rapport or it creates a thing where we're now doing the wrong exercise.
You push the client up into their head, thinking about it with your idea instead of this whole body experiential knowing.
Yeah, it's quicker that way. They say, "Oh yeah, I got it now," and they don't.
Yeah,
it doesn't take.
Sometimes, like you said, sometimes as the material's emerging, the client's describing things that are emerging into awareness. Sometimes you do really get it before the client does, especially with a lot of experience. And I'm not talking about theorizing. You understand what the client is describing, whoosh, more fully and accurately. The client's not there yet, and so to do coherence therapy, to stay in the experiential process and help the client get it, requires the discipline of not suddenly trying to show the client how brilliantly you got it and going into explaining it to the client. No, you got to stay with the same process of guiding the client to bring attention to it. So that's the first phase of finding the emotional learning that's maintaining the problem pattern Now comes memory reconsolidation, because now is the second half, guide the unlearning of that emotional learning. And that's what memory reconsolidation does. So what I did with this man, at the point where I understood that expecting all other people to respond like that is the target learning here, I simply said, hey, tell me something. Now, this is a Socratic question because I already know the answer, but I need it to come out of him. Have you ever done anything wrong, made a mistake in front of somebody, and they didn't respond like that at all? And they stayed relaxed and helpful and friendly. Now, I say it's a Socratic question because I knew the answer is yes. The guy's in his 40s. It had to have happened in his life. And sure enough, he hears the question. He looks into the middle distance for about 10 seconds. And sure enough, in his memory is responding to my question with, so a first example shows up. He says, yeah, I bought the wrong book. I bought the wrong book at the bookstore a few weeks ago. And I brought it back, and now that I look at it this way, I see that I was really tense bringing it to the clerk to exchange it for the right book. And the clerk was totally relaxed and friendly, like you said. And now I see that I was surprised. I guess I didn't notice that at the time. So there it is. We're on our way. Okay, great. Any others? And boy, a series came. All the way back to like in high school, he misconstrued the instructions for the term paper, and he handed in a term paper that was written on the wrong lines. And again, big surprise. The teacher was kind and relaxed. Said, "Okay, I'll give you 2 more weeks. You can rewrite it." And things went fine. So a whole range of trivial and major instances of doing something wrong visibly, and the other person responds. Totally different from that. Now, these memories and this knowledge that people don't always respond that way was in him all along, right? But it was held in memory areas quite separate from this emotional learning, or schema as we call it, according to which every human being is ready to rage and respond like that. All I'm doing is bringing the contradictory knowledge forward, and I'm going to have him hold them side by side. So that's what I did after he retrieved like 5 different memories of people responding calmly and friendly. I said, okay, so now let's review something. Now, before I describe this, I'm going to point out that the very first time, I'm pausing because I'm trying to make this very clear and succinct. Yeah, here's a better way to do it. So I went forward with him by saying, good, now let's review what you've learned about making mistakes in your life that we've seen so far. And with Dad, and I reviewed that, right? Any misstep, anything that he thinks is wrong, and you get blasted with scorching energy of rage and shaming words and humiliation in front of others, and it's just brutal ordeal. And you learn that that's what humans do in response to you making a mistake. So you're very tense around people. And yet, at the same time, we've also seen, and I review each of the 5 examples that he came up with. So He's not taking my word for anything here, and there's no theorizing, right? Now, the first one I name, back in high school, when you got the instructions wrong for the term paper, and your teacher was so kind and helpful in helping you set things right, that's so different than what you expected based on dad, right? Boom, right there. That is what the neuroscience researchers who study memory reconsolidation call prediction error. The target learning is encountering a concrete experience in which the target learning's prediction is wrong. And it's a direct, strong perception that it's wrong. It's not an idea. It's experiential. But I am calling his attention. I am getting him to hold the target learning, the problematic expectation, in the same field of awareness of his own experience that it ain't so. It's not true in that situation. That first prediction error, very rapidly, within a minute or two, is the brain signal to literally unlock the encoding of the target learning. That's a physical neurobiochemical change in the synapses and whatever else's encode these emotional learnings. We know it's synapses, but there may be other things. There's emerging knowledge about the brain cells that are not neurons, glia, astrocytes, all kinds of stuff is involved in the encoding of our memories. But whatever the encoding is made of is physically transformed into a different state that is now susceptible to being rewritten, re-encoded according to new knowledge coming in right now. That's the memory reconsolidation process happening. And so I continued with all 5 of those contradictory knowledge experiences, reviewed them the same way, creating this side-by-side experience of the target knowledge and its contradictory knowledge, disconfirmation. And we call that a juxtaposition experience. And that's what we're heading for all along, because that's what does the unlearning. And after I reviewed all 5, I said, so how is that for you? How is that for you, Don? To be holding both. This seemed true, but now this is also true. And they're so different. How is that for you? And he said, it's a surprise and it's a relief. He said, he was somewhat mystified. These juxtaposition experiences initially are very strange experiences for the client, because something that seemed like absolute, the given reality of the world, people rage at me and shame me when I do anything wrong. That was just like water is to a fish. That's just the way the world is. Suddenly, it's not the way the world is. It's a notion that I put together that I'm now seeing isn't the right notion. It was my notion of how all people are. So a very strange change of reality is happening in response to these juxtaposition experiences. But they result in the unlearning. The original learning no longer is sitting there the same way, triggerable. And indeed, for this man, he wound up, now some complications developed for him that we had to sort through for a few sessions, but it landed in him being able to be with people and not tighten up and not lose his ability to think and speak. The complication was that he came back in the next session. I was so eager to hear his report. And he said, well, something's really different, but it's not, his phrase was, but it's not a walk in the park, because if everybody's like my father, then my father was a normal parent. But if everybody's not like my father was really cruel. And that's really upsetting to see.
Mm.
And so
has to make room for grief.
Oh, grief and anguish. And Let's see. There was some anger too. There was an anger process too, naturally. It can get complicated right there. So we had to process all that, took several sessions. And once the grief and anger was, were he was okay with it, then he could really land in knowing that no, everybody is not like him.
So a couple of just responses to the story. One is, it doesn't sound like he needs to be going twice a week for 25 years, given this model.
8 sessions. I think it was 8 sessions total.
Right.
Felt, and I said, look, there might be other stuff from that, having that dad, that could use the same kind of process. And he said, well, probably, but not now. I'm good. I'm good. He was good. He never came back.
And I don't know if does some of this generalize? Like, if you do this process and then then his mother was a certain way, that it might his brain might rewrite everything. Like, I know you're a big fan of specificity. It doesn't work.
I haven't seen that happen much. What generalizes beautifully is the client has learned that their mind is coherent and not broken or malfunctioning. So they come back and people will say, okay, now I want to work on why I procrastinate. Let's do that again. Juxtapose me, okay? But people aren't so good usually. It's not a natural talent. I don't know if it's cultural or what. Look, some people, especially therapists who are my clients, can learn to do the discovery work and find it themselves, but usually not. Even Carl Jung, the master psychotherapist Carl Jung, said, I can't analyze my own dreams. I can't really ferret out the full meaning of my own dreams. I need somebody to, because you're subjectively in it, right? And it makes it very hard to do. It's possible to self-administer the whole process, but not too likely to be fully effective.
Gotcha.
So
I want to check with you the time, because I'm happy to keep going for several hours, but I know we contracted for an hour here, so I want to make sure that you're okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
For another few minutes.
Yeah, I could go longer. Yeah, I lost track of the time completely. I could go a little longer if you'd like. Maybe it would be better to switch over to your questions, if you have any in mind, rather than me following my nose the way I've been doing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing, the other response to this story, and my growing understanding of coherence therapy and memory reconsolidation, and sometimes it's growing and sometimes it's shrinking, because sometimes I'll ask you a question like, oh, I think you're something out, and you go, no, not that. So I'm very happy to sort of present theories here for you. And one is that, like, basically the brain exists to help us survive and reproduce. And so it makes, there's a way in which the conservative nature of learning makes sense, but also that there's this, like any learning, it's better to know the right thing than the wrong thing. It's better to have knowledge that is pertinent to the present, to the environment you're in, rather than a previous environment. And so I'm curious, like, why memory reconsolidation isn't, like, it doesn't happen more often, more spontaneously. Like, why do we need 100 years of and for you and your team to begin to put this all together?
Yeah, that's I've wondered about that too. Well, my current thinking about that is, I think we just have to look at what evolution set up and infer from that the existing setup was the most survival positive for conditions on Earth during evolution. In other words, that once an emotional learning forms, species survive better by sticking with it than by making it too easily changeable.
Gotcha.
So the degree of difficulty, look, memory reconsolidation does happen spontaneously. Well, the unlearning does happen spontaneously in life sometimes. And I love the examples I come across sometimes of that happening. My co-director, Sarah Bridges, in many of the trainings we've done together, has shared how that happened for her. And I'm sure she'll be. She's done it publicly, so I think it's okay for me to do it here. A learning from her childhood was that her father was quite harsh around any lateness, quite harsh. And when he's beginning to start to get triggered by lateness happening, where it looks like lateness is about to happen, he would start to jiggle his keys. He'd be holding his keys in his hand, and he'd start to jiggle them. So she'd hear the tinkling of the keys jiggling. So for her, that was like the Pavlovian learning, right? The bell. That sound meant there's imminent danger of severe harshness exploding, right? Well, fast forward decades, and she and her husband are getting ready to leave, go out and do something. And she hears him jiggling his keys. She's busy getting ready, and she hears his keys jiggling, and she gets very tense. And let's see how I'm not remembering the exact details, but this will be good enough. She said to him, "What's the matter? It's okay. It's okay. You know, like I'll be right there." And he could see that she's sort of in an anxious, fearful experience suddenly. He said, "What's the matter? What's wrong?" She says, "What do you mean? What's wrong? You're getting upset because I'm not on time." And he said, What are you talking about? I'm not upset at all. I'm just standing here waiting for you. I'm fine. I don't care if you're a little late. He said, "You're jiggling your keys." And "Oh yeah, I was. Yeah, it's just amusing to me while I'm waiting for you." And there it was. And that did it for her. She was so in touch with her learning and consciously in touch with this unmistakable contradictory knowledge. And that undid her generalization of that to other people. And I think it's a lovely example of how it happens ordinarily in the course of life. The brain is always ready to unlearn these things that have been potently re-triggering for decades and would go to the end unless the right combination of experiences happen.
Yeah. And what's coming up for me is like the unknown grace of how many times in my life have I been a disconfirmation for somebody that I'll never know about.
Ah, that's right. That's right.
Like the high school teacher or the clerk at the bookstore.
Right.
I'm just struck by the amazing, like I want to do such good in the world and I want to achieve and have scale and like these little, like it's the little moments, like who knows what the cascading
That's
of things can be.
That's right.
Being decent.
It reminds me of that movie, It's a Wonderful Life, what you just said. Right? Because that's what that movie's all about. That man is led to see all the good that he's done in other people's lives without any realization, any awareness of it. And I think that is happening a lot, especially for you.
Well,
actually, I mean it. I'm sure it just pours off of you. Yeah, because
and where it doesn't, there's a good reason.
That's right. That's right. The brain is evolution set up this emotional learning and memory system, including its memory reconsolidation capacity, to, like you said, yes, be very conservative because the emotional learnings are probably survival necessary or survival positive. So only if the disconfirmation leaves no wiggle room The brain has to see, boy, there's no wiggle room. I got it wrong the first time. Now, my client that I described earlier here, he had all 5 of those contradictory knowledge experiences happen, right? But none of them happened while he was also conscious of expecting everyone to be like Dad. So there were no juxtaposition experiences in those 5 instances. Only when I led him to retrieve all those 5 alongside the conscious expectation that people are going to respond like Dad did the unlearning happen. That's part of the brain's conservatism about preserving emotional learnings once they're formed. Life brings these contradictory though they aren't functioning as contradictory knowledge. Life brings these experiences that could function as disconfirmation of negative learnings we're carrying. But they don't function that way because the juxtaposition doesn't happen. These negative learnings we carry are in separate memory networks from these experiences that could do the job. But that's why one of the main techniques, we have many different techniques for finding the contradictory knowledge once the discovery process is done. And one of them is past opposite experiences like I did with that fellow. But there are other ways to find it too.
Right. And speaking of other ways, one of the things I really appreciate about you and your work is how trans-theoretical it is.
Yeah.
That, you and some colleagues have created coherence therapy, which is directly mapping a process based on memory reconsolidation. But in the most recent edition, I think the second edition of your book, Unlocking the Emotional Brain, you've got chapter after chapter after chapter about other systems of psychotherapy. There it is. For those who are watching the video, beautiful green and yellow paperback title.
Yeah.
There's internal family systems. There's AEDP. There's
EMDR,
EMDR.
experiencing. We even have a detailed case of psychedelic assisted therapy with ayahuasca in part 2 that shows in detail that whenever any of these, well, here it's 8 different therapy systems, very different therapy systems. Whenever they achieve transformational change, you can find this specific set of experiences was facilitated just before the markers of transformational change start to show up. So yes, we're very deliberately working to show the therapy field that there's this core process that can be facilitated in many different ways by many different therapy systems. And each system has its own theoretical framework, right, for describing how it happens and and its own methodology and techniques for how to do it. But when you recognize this core non-theoretical process, when you understand that core experiential process, some therapists have said to us, now I feel like I have X-ray vision because I can see through the theory and the specific techniques of any particular system. And I can see when that system is accomplishing this same core process to achieve transformational change. And that's exactly what part 2 of the book is designed to show in a convincing way. Yeah.
Yeah, just got a couple more questions. One is, I'm curious whether you have found memory reconsolidation in Advaita Vedanta, like in any of these ancient texts. Did they have the same way like all ancient Chinese texts sometimes have physics insights that it's taken us to get to quantum physics? Like was this wisdom known at some level?
Oh boy. This is a topic I'm very interested in. And to give you an answer briefly enough that's why I sighed. I'll try. The answer is yes. It's not the detailed procedure of memory reconsolidation, to my knowledge, that I ever came across in those Eastern spiritual, mystical, whatever, metaphysical knowledge traditions. What I came across is something that I felt I have seen in my psychotherapy work, which is that it's the idea of Maya, illusion, that the world is illusion, and that the source of the illusion is one's own being, one's own consciousness, and that consciousness can wake up and get free of the illusion and see it as illusion and know its own true nature. That's really the core, I think, message of most of these traditions. Yes, what happens in coherence therapy and any transformational change produced by any system of therapy is that, and when you and I were talking about agency earlier, we were getting very close to this, what I'm about to say. Yeah, the client, the person has the direct experience. Oh yeah, we actually said this earlier in this interview. They have the direct experience that what seemed to be and what they were taking to be the world, the given world as it is, was actually an invention of their own mind. Any specific emotional learning that is driving a problem pattern initially seems to the client to be the nature of the world, as if it's objectively the truth of the world. And as a result of this process, the client awakens to the direct experience that was a fabrication, a construction, an invention, a construing of their own mind that they have now seen was only a construing of their own mind, and they have seen that it's false, and as soon as they experience the falseness, their own mind decommissions that version of reality. Poof. One of the ways we check for success is to guide the client to try to have the same original experience. And I think you may have seen some of my videos of real sessions where I do that. I guide let's go back. You know, your mother just, you know, exploded with rage or went into a panic attack and blah blah blah. Try and have the same experience, and the client tries to revisit having the panic attack, having the fear, having the shame, and instead bursts into gleeful laughter. That's one of the. It's not always gleeful laughter, but it's often. At the absurdity of seeing it that way now. It's a gleeful laughter of joy of being free of it, and it's a gleeful laughter at the absurdity of having seen it that way. There's no realness left to that original view that seemed, you know, grimly real, direly real when we started. So there is an experience that I have recognized in these Eastern, usually, teachings about reality and consciousness. That what we take as real is an illusion, and we can wake up and see the illusion and get free of it. And that we ourselves are the author of the illusion.
That's so funny, because when I celebrated the arrival of your book, and here in Spain, it's hard to get books sometimes. They can take weeks. And it arrived, and to celebrate, I went to the store and I bought 4 highlighters. Only because it only came, I only wanted yellow, but it came in a 4-pack. So I decided I needed to use the other 3 colors. So yellow is just things to remember. You know, pink was questions, orange was things I wanted to look up, like references that I wanted to go follow up. But I had green, and I didn't have anything to do with green. And then they had a line, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but something like how the mind is actually casting a spell.
Yeah.
It was near the beginning, and that one was green.
Yes.
Because that was kind of like, there's so much that I understand about that I don't yet understand that I understand.
Yeah, yeah, it keeps emerging. For me too. It keeps emerging. It's wonderful. Yeah. Yes, the spell, Maya. The George Harrison lyric, Beware of Maya, in one of his songs. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, we're all deep in these spells, and we can dispel them and get free of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'm thinking about is when I look at sort of ancient texts from wherever, they were all sort of these ritualistic systems were all communal based, and you're talking about it's very hard for people to have spontaneous, juxtapositions and memory reconsolidation, that it happens in relationship or in community.
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, you probably usually. But no, people have juxtapositions. There are learnings that are existential, that aren't about human relationships. There are learnings about how illness can happen and deprive you of things you thought you were going to be doing, for example. That's an existential learning. And people have spontaneous disconfirmations of their existential learnings. Walking along a trail, boom, either something happens, or you just have certain thoughts that never were in the same field of awareness. And you realize, wait a minute, that's not what I thought it was. Yeah.
Would Christianity call that grace?
Oh, there are so many different forms of Christianity that call things different things. I don't know. Maybe. I've never come across that.
Mm-hmm.
But conceivably, yes, it's a becoming free at a deep level. So yeah, I can imagine somebody calling it. I wouldn't call it grace.
Right.
I think other things are grace.
Okay.
But there's just personal, meanings, semantic.
Yeah. Well, last question. One of the books you've co-written and published recently is called The Listening Book. And it's a book not necessarily for therapists. And I feel like it's going to arise, how to create a world of rich connections and surprising growth by actually hearing each other. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
And it's really written in such a fun and accessible way. You have all these different dialogues, and then, graphics to show where there was a disconnection. And it seems like, and overtly, in one of the later chapters, you talk about memory reconsolidation at a level that maybe a layperson could understand, and you say that maybe deep listening could bring this about. And I know I sort of asked this question a little bit in the group, but like, where do you see this work going? And my daughter Yael, who you also know, who's joined the group, asked me, how can we bring this into education? Like, what if there was a school that was memory reconsolidation informed? Like, where do you want beyond therapists? Like, where do you want this to go, and where can it go?
Great question. Yes, please do it. We've had our hand. Yes, it needs to go into the political field, into all kinds of areas that would help dispel the spells that that human life is so afflicted with. Absolutely. We haven't managed to do any of that yet, simply because the work of putting this into the therapy field has fully occupied us for over 20 years. All that it takes to get this installed in the therapy field solidly enough for it to stay there and have its effects has been fully occupying. I haven't even had enough bandwidth to start to map out how to get it into education and other fields. I think if you Googled memory reconsolidation education, I think you'll see stuff. I think there are people starting to do that. But absolutely, it needs to happen. Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, hundreds more questions, but I feel like this is a good resting place for now.
Good.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I've been
Oh,
looking forward to
gladly.
this, and I've just had a wonderful time
Gladly.
talking
This
with you.
is my idea of having fun. So gladly, and I really appreciate your interest and your excellent questions and your invitation. Thank you, Howie.
All right. Well, so for folks who want to know more, there's a website specifically for therapists or coaches or people who want to get trained. Can you share where people can find out more about you?
Yeah, yeah. Coherenceinstitute.org.
Okay, great. And they can find the books there and
everything. Yeah.
One question is to your knowledge, are there live demos of coherent, like classic coherence sessions on YouTube?
Oh, no, not on YouTube. On our website, there's quite a few different real sessions that are, there's one series of 5 different videos that's called the Coherence Therapy Training Demonstration Series for that purpose. But no, we don't have real clients on YouTube to public. We try and limit it to only therapists and counselors and coaches. Yeah.
Okay, because that's one of the things I'm doing with coaching clients, which the problems tend not to be as, needing privacy sometimes, but also I think it's really useful for people to be able to see the magic.
Yes, the more the better. Absolutely. Yeah. What I do in the public videos is narrate cases like I did somewhat here in our talk. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, so I feel, and I'll agree, we are so fortunate to have found you and Tori and the team, and are so
great team.
So thrilled to, because it's also, I guess, one final question. Like, I know how this is beginning to change who I am just as a guy out there in the world and how I see the world. I'm curious what your experience has been of like adopting a coherence mindset just in your life.
Well, I assume that everybody's manifestation is coherent. So it helps me when people are difficult from my point of view, either in their personal behavior in relation to me or in the room or in politics. It does help me to assume, there's a famous quotation of, I think it's Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This won't be exactly exact, but close. If we knew the secret history of our worst enemies, it would disarm all hostility. Right? In other words, people are the way they are as an expression of their adaptive emotional learnings, what they learned from what they suffered. And if we knew all that, we'd have a more heartful response, even to people who are very negative in our view, in their effects. So it doesn't mean it's all fine. It doesn't mean anything goes. People who are doing harm need to be stopped somehow.
Yeah, I feel like there's
just the nature of my response and the meaning of the world I'm in is according to coherence. So maybe that's as much as I know how to say about that in response. Is that a useful response?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about being coherent or adopting a coherent mindset when people are being difficult towards me, there's a part of my conditioning, and I think it's largely cultural, that says if I'm coherent, if I see that, if I disarm hostility, I'm going to be the victim. And yet there's a deeper knowing that I don't think I have fully, juxtaposed. Says the more I see reality, the more effective I can be, rather than less effective. It's a pull. It's a
this gets subtle and requires discernments and delicate trade-offs. I'm reminded of something I once read about the samurai tradition in Japan, samurai warriors.
Hmm.
You may know that it's very, very centrally important to a samurai, even in the midst of the most fierce battle response, to never run anger or rage.
Hmm.
There must be no anger or rage. That interferes with proper samurai skill and action. So, see, there's an example that came to mind from what you just said. There's an example of being able to respond forcefully as needed without going into the kinds of meanings or reactions that the standard adversarial polarization sense making would have us feel.
Hmm. That's a lovely image to, because it's so empowering. It's not.
It's empowering, yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And I think in some ways it's contagious, right? Like the more people we can get to see the world in terms of like everything makes sense, and if we
Yes.
can see it, I mean, the amount of self-compassion I have for myself, as you mentioned, from things that I have not dealt with, I have not fixed, but I'm like, oh, it's doing a job. I don't know what the job is. I don't know why it's doing the job, but at least it doesn't spin me into anxiety. It doesn't, create a feedback loop that makes things so much worse.
Right, right. That's it. Oh, just yesterday something came up with someone. What was it? It was, oh yes, if someone reacts to me with sudden annoyance or impatience or vexation, my old tendency would be to push back, like, hey, cut it out, or hey, don't talk to me like that. With a coherence mindset, my response is more likely to be, gosh, something I said really upset you. I see that. What is it? I don't know what upset you like this. Tell me what's got you so upset. Because I'm assuming coherence. I'm assuming the person's upsetness is somehow meaningful in their world of meaning and appropriate, even though I'm clueless about what it is. So I ask, help me understand what just got you so upset. Now we will directly come back into shared reality by pursuing that. Otherwise, we're just polarizing and having a bad, adversarial encounter. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to try that this week.
Yeah, that's a very useful one. It's hard to remember in the quickness of the way these things happen, but yeah, it's good to try and get that installed. I like it a lot.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you so much for this conversation, for taking the time, and for everything you and the folks you are working with have done for the world. I feel so much more hope. It's just like this is possible.
Yes, it is. Good. Thank you, Howie. Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
And that's a wrap. You can find the show notes for today's episode at plantyourself.com/588. I highly recommend getting Bruce's book. It is comprehensive and dense, and it's written for therapists, but it's worth working your way through. It's called Unlocking the Emotional Brain. Also, if you're interested, look up Dr. Tori Olds. That's Toriolds. She's a student and collaborator of Dr. Ecker. I found his work through her. I have a podcast interview with Tori Olds. You can look that up. I don't have the number off the top of my head. She makes wonderful YouTube videos, sometimes short, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, that really dive into memory reconsolidation, coherence therapy, and other therapies and how they use the memory reconsolidation framework to accomplish the transformational change when it does occur. So what's going on here? I am gearing up for Burgos for the Grass Ultimate Tournament. Been doing a lot of beach sprinting, and hopefully the beach is, being so much harder. It's like swinging a baseball bat with a heavy metal donut on it, that when you actually take the donut off, it feels light. So I'm hoping that running on grass will give me those gazelle-like leaps that will give me speed and help me have some stamina. Also, yesterday I started an experiment. I think I'm going to run it for 30 days and see how it goes. I watched a short TEDx talk by Rolf Dobelli. It was recorded in 2011, less than 5 minutes, and it was called Stop Watching the News. And I realized I've been spending a lot of time on my phone just in the morning, just sort of scrolling through stuff or having a laptop on my belly and then checking the news frequently throughout the day, and realizing I'm getting very little, if anything, out of it other than anxiety. And so the goal is for the next 30 days to spend 0 time on anything that is not good for me. And that what is good for me is a broad category. It includes doing good work, marketing the business, reading interesting things, whether fiction or nonfiction, playing sports, resting, napping, hanging out, eating good food, cooking good food. So it's not like it's any kind of austere, monkish existence. It's just cutting out what I think was probably like an hour or an hour and a half of just sort of online scrolling, reading things. And it wasn't even so much social media, but news. New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, The Atlantic, The Nation, Foreign Affairs, The Hill, Al Jazeera, all the sources that I look at to understand what's happening in the world. Letting go of that for a month and seeing how that goes. So I'll let you know how the experiment continues. Yesterday, I think I took all of the time that I had been spending on the news sleeping, which seems like a pretty good deal. I've been quite tired for a while. I'm not sure if I'm not sleeping well at night or just this move is catching up to me, or if it's sort of, the cortisol cycles of anxiety that come from being very aware of what's going on in the world today. But I'm doing this experiment for my health and for the well-being of myself and my family and my community. Let you know how it goes. All right, that's all for this week. As always, be well, my friends. All right, time for thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his beautiful song Sabali Dawn, The Dance of Peace. You can find more of Will's music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself Podcast patrons. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Brittany Porter, Dominic Maurer, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Tina Scharf, Tina Ahern, Jen Filkinovsky, David Bizek, The Mysterious Michelle X, Elsbeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Kelly Cameron, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Bennett, Gila Sert, David Donahue, Blair Cyborg, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesner, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, Aviva Lael, Alicia Lemus, Val Linneman, Nick Harper, Bandana Chawley, Molly Levine, The Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Scharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Copel, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Sharon Hirschman, Linda Ayat, Holm Hedegaard, Isa Tuzinwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Olakoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Marani, Karen and Joe Crabtree, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Peter W. Evans, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Lori Fanny, Linnea Lundquist, Emily Iconelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Leenan, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bilberry Elf, Marjorie Lewis, Tricia Adams, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunmarie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Mama Says, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Paranganchi, Amy Daly, Brian Tourville, Mark Jeffrey Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perryman, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Naik, Erica Piedra, Danielle Roberts, Michael Lushton, Sarah Johnson, Catherine Floyd, for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for now. As always, be well, my friends.